Ray is 46. Last month his net worth crossed $750,000. And he told almost nobody. No dinner out, no toast, just a login screen that finally read 750 instead of 749. By the numbers, Ray is doing better than most people his age. But there's a version of this story where Ray loses a chunk of that number in the next 3 years and never fully understands why. I've watched it happen to smarter people than Ray, and it rarely starts with a crash. It starts with a decision that feels completely reasonable at the time. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud about this specific number, $750,000, is the point where the market can move more money in a single afternoon than you earn in a month. At $50,000, a bad week costs you a car payment. At $750,000, a bad week can cost you a year of savings. And the frustrating truth is, most people who cross this line make the exact same mistake. They start managing this money the same way they managed their first $50,000. Different game, same instincts. That mismatch is where the damage happens. I want to walk you through why this number behaves differently than the ones before it. What actually separates the people who turn 750 into a comfortable retirement from the ones who quietly bleed it out. And even if the number on the screen looks almost identical, every video like this skips entirely. Because your $750,000 is not the same $750,000 as your neighbor's, even if the number on the screen looks identical. Let's do the math nobody bothers to do out loud. At $50,000 net worth, a 10% market drop costs you $5,000. Annoying. Recoverable in a few months of normal saving. At $750,000, that same 10% drop costs $75,000. For a household earning the median American income, that's more than a full year's take-home pay. Gone in the time it takes a headline to cycle through your phone. Here's the number that actually matters. Once you cross roughly $750,000, the swings in your portfolio start to outpace what you can save your way out of. A rough 2% day, which happens more often than people think, moves about $15,000. Most people don't save $15,000 in a month. So for the first time, your behavior matters more than your paycheck. That's not a motivational line, it's arithmetic. And this is where I want to be honest about something most finance channels gloss over. The Federal Reserve's most recent household wealth data puts the typical net worth for someone in their mid-40s to mid-50s somewhere around $250,000. Once you adjust for where prices sit today, $750,000 isn't an average outcome. It puts you meaningfully ahead of most people your age. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it means the stakes here are real. You're not protecting pocket change, you're protecting a genuine head start. Before I go further, here's the honest wrinkle. $750,000 doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. And pretending it does is where a lot of these videos go wrong. $750,000 in a paid-off house in a lower cost of living state might mean you're close to financially free. The same $750,000 for someone renting in a major metro, still carrying a mortgage-sized housing cost, with 2 kids headed toward college, is a very different situation. Wearing the same number, net worth is a snapshot. It doesn't tell you what's locked in home equity you can't easily touch, what's sitting in a 401k you can't access for another 15 years, or what your actual monthly obligations look like. I say this because I've watched people hit a round number, feel rich for a weekend, and make decisions based on the number instead of their actual cash flow. The number is real, but treat it as a starting point for a conversation with your own numbers, not a verdict. I want you to meet 2 people I've watched play this out in real life, with the details changed, but the pattern is one I've seen more times than I can count. Priya is 44, works in operations, makes a solid but unremarkable salary. She hits $750,000 mostly in low-cost index funds. And here's the detail that matters. When she got 2 raises over the past 6 years, Her spending barely moved. Same car, same house, slightly better vacations. That's the whole secret. Nothing clever. Derek is 45, a small business owner, also sitting at $750,000. But Derek's number is scattered. A rollover 401k he hasn't looked at since 2019. A brokerage account he opened with an advisor his cousin recommended. Some company stock he's never sold out of loyalty. Derek isn't careless. He's just never once added up what all of it is actually costing him. Run the same market on both of them for the next 20 years, and the gap becomes enormous. Not because Priya is smarter, but because one of them is quietly paying a toll that never shows up as a line item. There's a third person worth mentioning, because this mistake looks completely different, and it comes from the opposite instinct. Call him Walt, 51, who watched his father lose a chunk of his retirement in 2008 and swore he'd never let that happen to him. Walt's $750,000 is mostly sitting in cash and short-term CDs, earning a rate that felt generous a couple of years ago. Walt isn't reckless. If anything, he's the most careful person in this story. But careful and correct aren't always the same thing. And Walt is about to find that out slowly, over the next decade, in a way that never feels dramatic enough to notice in the moment. Here's the part that actually matters. All three of these people did the hard part already. Reaching $750,000 on an ordinary income, without an inheritance or a business sale, puts you ahead of most people who will ever try. But 5 years from now, these three numbers will look nothing alike, and none of the three would tell you, in the moment, that they were making a mistake. That's what makes this stretch of the journey more dangerous than the one that got you here. Nothing about it feels wrong while it's happening. Here's the first move almost nobody makes, and it costs nothing. When you hit a number like this, the instinct is to loosen up a little. A nicer car, a bigger house, a few subscriptions you don't really use. None of these feel like mistakes individually. Run the number. Add $1,500 a month in new lifestyle spending, and that's $18,000 a year you're no longer investing at a 7% return. $18,000 a year compounds to roughly $260,000 over a decade, so that slightly nicer everything doesn't cost you $1,500 a month. It costs you $250,000 you'll never see arrive. Priya's version of this was almost boring. Her income went up, her spending didn't. That's the entire strategy. Freezing your lifestyle for even 3 or 4 years, while the number underneath you keeps compounding, is the single highest leverage move available at this stage, and it requires zero investment knowledge at all. Once your account gets this large, 7% a year stops feeling exciting on a screen, even though on $750,000, that's over $50,000 of growth. Boredom is expensive, because boredom is exactly what a salesman is counting on. Somebody will eventually tell Ray his money deserves better than an index fund. They'll pitch something private, something exclusive, something promising 15 or 18% with barely any risk. Here's the rule I've never seen broken in 25 years around this business. Guaranteed and double-digit are two words that don't belong in the same sentence. Every extra point of promised return is hiding a point of risk you simply haven't been shown yet. At this stage of the game, your job isn't to find the next great opportunity. It's to not lose the money you've already built. Avoiding one catastrophic mistake matters more than chasing one exciting win, because the math of losing 40% and needing a 67% gain just to get back to even is brutal, and most people who chase yield learn that the hard way. Once, I've sat across the table from people who put a real chunk of a number like this into a private real estate deal, or a friend's startup, or some structured note nobody in the room could actually explain in plain terms. The pitch always sounds airtight in the moment. It usually involves a phrase like, "This isn't available to just anyone," which is doing more work than people realize, because scarcity feels like validation when it's actually just a sales technique. The honest test is simple. Ask whoever's pitching you exactly where the extra return is coming from, in plain language, and watch what happens. If the answer is vague, if it leans on trust instead of mechanics, that's the entire answer you need. Walk away before you're emotionally invested in being right about it. None of this means avoid every opportunity outside of index funds for the rest of your life. It means at $750,000, a single bad swing at an exciting return can undo years of the boring compounding that got you here. And the boring compounding was never actually boring, it was just quiet. Buried in Derek's old brokerage statement is a 1.2% advisory fee he agreed to years ago and forgot about on $750,000. That's $9,000 a year, paid whether the market is up, down, or sideways. Run that forward. A 1.2% drag compounding against you for 20 years turns into a difference of roughly $580,000 compared to the same money growing fee-free. Not a typo. Over 10 years, that same fee gap runs about $155,000. Fees don't announce themselves. They just quietly compound in the wrong direction, year after year. While everything else in your portfolio looks completely normal, the fix for Derek takes one afternoon. Pull every statement, find every expense ratio, and ask a blunt question. What am I actually paying in real dollars every year? If nobody can answer that clearly, that's your answer. Low-cost index funds today often run around 0.03 to 0.05%. Moving from a 1.2% fee to something close to that isn't a minor optimization at this net worth. It's close to the biggest single decision you'll make all year, and it takes no investing skill whatsoever. Here's something that gets skipped almost every time this topic comes up, and it's worth real money at $750,000. The mix of accounts you're holding matters almost as much as how that money grows. A dollar sitting in a Roth account is not the same as a dollar sitting in a traditional 401k. Even though both statements might show the exact same balance, the Roth dollar has already been taxed and will never be taxed again, no matter how large it grows. The traditional dollar still owes the IRS a share. Whatever your tax rate happens to be whenever you eventually pull it out, most people never think about this distinction because it doesn't show up as a difference on the app. It only shows up later, at withdrawal, when it's much harder to fix. The general principle financial planners lean on is putting your fastest growing assets inside the Roth, where none of that growth ever gets taxed again, and keeping the slower, steadier holdings like bonds inside the traditional accounts, where the eventual tax bite is smaller relative to the growth you gave up. This is called asset location, and it's different from asset allocation, which is about what you own. Asset location is about which account holds what you own, and getting it backwards can quietly cost years of retirement income over a few decades. There's a second tool almost nobody outside of financial planning circles talks about, and it's called tax loss harvesting. When an investment in a regular taxable account drops in value, you can sell it, immediately buy something similar to stay invested, and use that paper loss to offset other gains, or even a few $1,000s of ordinary income each year. It sounds like a small thing. Done consistently over a decade, in a down year or two, it can add up to a meaningful reduction in what you owe the IRS. Money that stays invested instead of leaving your account every April. None of this requires becoming an accountant. It requires one real conversation with a fee-only planner who can look at your specific accounts and tell you where the free money is sitting. Most people at this level are leaving some on the table, simply because nobody ever pointed it out. If your employer offers a high-deductible health plan, there's a tool sitting right next to it that almost nobody at this net worth level is using correctly. A health savings account. It's the only account in the entire tax code that gives you a deduction going in, tax-free growth while it's invested, and tax-free withdrawals coming out. As long as the money goes toward medical expenses, most people treat it like a glorified checking account for doctor visits and drain it every year, left alone and invested instead. Even a modest contribution compounding for 15 or 20 years can turn into a meaningful, entirely tax-free bucket for the medical costs that show up later in life. And those costs are close to guaranteed. This one is easy to miss because it doesn't get marketed the way a 401k does. But at this stage, it's worth treating like the retirement account it actually is. There's a risk almost nobody at this level accounts for. And it has nothing to do with average returns. It's called sequence risk. And it matters most once you're pulling money out instead of putting it in. Picture two people, both with $1 million, both withdrawing $50,000 a year, both averaging the same 5% return over 20 years. The only difference is which years the bad returns land in. The person who hits a market drop in year 1 or 2, while still withdrawing, can end up hundreds of thousands of dollars behind the person who hits that same drop in year 18, same average, wildly different outcome. Purely because of timing. If you're getting close to using this money instead of just growing it, staying fully aggressive by default isn't discipline. It's a bet you might not need to make. Holding 1 to 2 years of expenses in cash isn't playing it safe out of fear. It's what lets you avoid selling stocks at the exact moment they're down 20%, which on $1 million portfolio is $200,000 you'd be locking in as a permanent loss instead of a temporary dip. Here's why the order matters so much more than people expect. When you're adding money, a crash early on is actually fine, even good, because you're buying in at lower prices for years afterward. But once you're withdrawing, a crash early on forces you to sell more shares to generate the same dollar amount, which permanently shrinks the pile that's left to recover when the market eventually bounces back. Two people can retire with identical $1 million balances, take out the exact same amount every year, and average the exact same return over 2 decades, and still end up worlds apart, purely because of which years the good and bad returns happen to land in. It's the one risk that almost never shows up in a simple retirement calculator, because those calculators usually assume a smooth average return every single year, and markets have never once behaved that way. Most people get cash exactly backwards, and they get it wrong in opposite directions depending on their temperament. Someone who watched their parents lose money in 2008 tends to keep far too much sitting in a savings account earning 4%. Which sounds fine until you remember inflation has been running close to 3% most years recently. That leaves a real return closer to 1%, while the market has historically compounded closer to 7% on $500,000 held that way for 20 years instead of invested. The gap runs into the millions. Feeling safe and being safe are not the same thing. And inflation doesn't care how careful you feel. The other mistake is the opposite, keeping almost nothing in cash, then being forced to sell investments during a downturn because an emergency hit at the worst possible time. 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash is the number that actually works for most households. Enough to sleep at night without giving inflation a 2-decade head start on your money. Once real money is involved, there's a piece of this that has nothing to do with investing at all. And it's the piece people skip because it isn't exciting. If Ray has no will, no updated beneficiaries, and something happens to him tomorrow, $750,000 can sit frozen in probate for the better part of a year while his family waits. A basic will and updated beneficiary forms fix that in an afternoon. On the insurance side, this is worth getting right instead of guessing. A personal umbrella policy, generally in the range of $300 to $600 a year for $1 million of liability coverage, protects your entire net worth from something as ordinary as a car accident, where you're found at fault Insurance costs have crept up over the past couple of years as jury awards have gotten larger. So it's worth an actual quote rather than assuming an old number still applies. Either way, for a few $100s a year, you're protecting a number that took you a decade or more to build. That's not a close call. Here's the part that has nothing to do with spreadsheets. Once the number gets big, people start checking it constantly. And every green or red day starts to feel personal. On $750,000, a routine 2% swing moves $15,000 before lunch. Watch that happen daily, and you'll eventually talk yourself into a decision you wouldn't make with a clear head. The people who actually keep this money check rarely, and do almost nothing in between. Priya looks at her accounts once a month, closes the app, and goes back to her life. There's also comparison, which gets louder the more you have. Once you're at 750, you start noticing the friend with the bigger house or the cousin talking about some crypto trade. None of that has anything to do with whether your money is on track for what you actually need. The only comparison that matters is your money against your own future. Nothing else. If there's one shift worth remembering here, it's this. The habits that got you to $750,000 are not the same habits that keep it. Getting here rewarded hustle, extra hours, raises, aggressive saving. Keeping it rewards something closer to restraint, freezing lifestyle creep, cutting the fees you didn't notice, automating so emotion never gets a vote, and covering the downside with a will and the right insurance so one bad afternoon can't undo a decade of good ones. None of that is thrilling. Priya's version of wealth building looks almost nothing like the version people post about online. She automates a fixed amount every payday, checks her accounts once a month, and otherwise leaves it alone. That's the whole system. Boring, repeatable, and it works precisely because there's nothing left for emotion to interfere with. Ray's real job now isn't to be brilliant, it's to avoid the handful of avoidable mistakes that quietly cost people this exact amount of money every single year. Guard what you've built. Let the math keep working in the background, and check in on your own terms instead of the market sieve. If you found this useful, subscribe to Gray Finances. Every week we break down the decisions that actually move the needle at this stage, without the hype and without the sales pitch,